Hello everyone. Today we're diving into a jaw-dropping showdown. Mr. Hoan slams down the evidence file and threatens them, but Jame tears the first copy in half and says, "You keep the hard copy, we keep the duplicates." Then Diep calmly places her phone on the desk, already recording, and asks, "Do you want to continue or stop here?" Stay with us, because this moment exposes Mr. Hoan's true face and changes everything. The elevator doors open with a soft chime that feels too polite for what's coming. Jame steps out first. His shoulders are square, his pace unhurried, like he refuses to let fear set the tempo. Diep follows a half step behind, calm on the outside, but with a hand pressed lightly to her phone in her coat pocket, as if she's holding on to a lifeline. The hallway to Mr. Hoan's office is quiet. Expensive quiet, the kind of quiet that says people here don't raise their voices because they don't have to. At the end of the corridor, the assistant barely looks up before opening the door. "Mr. Hoan is expecting you." The door swings inward, and the room smells like polished wood, cold air, and certainty. Mr. Hoan stands behind his desk, not sitting. He doesn't greet them. He doesn't offer a chair. He watches them walk in like he's watching two chess pieces move into a trap he already designed. A thick file sits on the desk, not one of his, not company documents. A file Jame recognizes instantly because he has seen those pages before, on his own kitchen table, laid out in careful stacks. Screenshots, timelines, a traffic camera still. Copies of messages, notes, dates, evidence. Mr. Hoan's mouth curls. Not quite a smile, not quite contempt. He picks up the file slowly, like he wants them to feel the weight of it. Then he slams it down. The sound is sharp, final. "Do you think I don't know what those two kids are holding?" he says. The word kids isn't an accident. It's a reminder. I still see you as small. I still see you as mine, to move. Diep's face stays composed, but her eyes flicker to the file like it just turned into a live wire. Jame doesn't flinch. He takes one step forward, not rushing, not hesitating, just moving into the pressure like he has decided he's done walking backward. Mr. Hoan tilts his head. "You gathered your little folder, your little story. You thought you could scare me with paper?" Jame's voice is low, steady. You didn't bring it here to laugh at it." Mr. Hoan's eyes narrow. Jame reaches toward the file, and for a second, the entire room holds its breath, because this is the moment Mr. Hoan expects a son to pause, to ask permission, to soften. Jame doesn't. He slides the file toward himself and pulls out the first copy, the top set of pages, and tears it cleanly in half. The rip is loud, violent in its simplicity. Diep's breath catches. Mr. Hoan's expression freezes for a beat, surprise slipping through the cracks of his control. Jame lays the torn halves on the desk like a statement, not an apology. "You keep the hard copy," Jame says. His words are calm, but each one lands like a nail. "We keep the duplicates." Mr. Hoan's nostrils flare. He doesn't like surprises. He likes obedience. He likes sons who negotiate from fear. Jame is negotiating from certainty. Mr. Hoan's voice drops colder. "So this is what you came here to do? Perform?" Jame doesn't blink. "Declare." The silence that follows is thick enough to feel. Then Mr. Hoan takes a slow breath and reaches for a glass of water on his desk. He lifts it, drinks like he's buying time, like he's steadying the mask back into place. He sets the glass down gently, too gently. "Let's be clear," Mr. Hoan says. "Everything you have belongs to me. Every connection you think protects you exists because I allow it." Diep steps forward for the first time. Not dramatic, not trembling, just present. She places her phone on the desk, right beside the torn paper. The screen is already on. A red dot pulses softly. Recording. Diep's voice is quiet, almost polite. Do you want to continue? Or stop here? Mr. Hoan's eyes flick to the phone. The smallest shift happens in his posture. Not fear of the law. Mr. Hoan has lived too long believing the law is something that bends for men like him. But fear of exposure. Because when something is recorded, it stops being a private lesson. It becomes a story other people can hear. And Mr. Hoan hates witnesses. He straightens slowly. You think that little toy is going to protect you? Diep doesn't move her hands. She doesn't raise her voice. It's not a toy, she says. It's light. Jame watches her, and something in his gaze softens for half a second. Not weakness, just respect. Because Diep isn't challenging Mr. Hoan with anger. She's challenging him with calm, and calm is harder to crush. Mr. Hoan's jaw tightens. He glances at Jame, then back at Diep. You came into my office, he says, and you place a phone on my desk like you own the air in this room. Diep meets his eyes. No, I'm placing it here so you remember you're not the only one who can hold a line. A muscle jumps in Mr. Hoan's cheek. He reaches for the file again, flips it open, taps a page with a finger that doesn't shake. You're playing a dangerous game, he says. He looks at Diep. A girl with nothing. And you, he looks at Jame. A son who thinks he can erase his bloodline with a folder. Jame's voice stays even. You're the one who started the game. Mr. Hoan lets out a short laugh. Oh? Did I? His eyes sharpen. Tell me, Jame. If you wanted to end this, you could. You could come home. You could stop dragging this woman behind you like a flag. You could be my son again. Diep's hand curls slightly at her side, but she keeps her chin lifted. Jame answers softly, almost sadly. I am your son. That's the problem. You think that means I'm your asset. Mr. Hoan's gaze hardens. You are. Jame's eyes hold steady. Not anymore. Something flickers behind Mr. Hoan's expression. Irritation, impatience. Something sharp. He moves his hand fast. He slams it down on the desk. The glass of water jumps, tips, and spills. Water runs across the polished surface, soaking the edges of the file, darkening the paper, smearing ink, turning evidence into a mess. Mr. Hoan's voice rises for the first time. Who do you think you are, he snaps, to use my child to threaten his father? The words hang, and that's when the mask slips. Because for weeks, months, Mr. Hoan has been strategic. He has spoken in riddles. He has moved in shadows. He has played the noble father in public and the invisible hand in private. But right now, in this room with a red recording dot blinking on Diep's phone, Mr. Hoan is not strategic. He's exposed. Jame takes one step forward, just one. But it changes the temperature of the room. He speaks very slowly, like he wants every syllable to be undeniable. Father, Jame says, you kept a child out of reach to threaten adults. Mr. Hoan's eyes flash. Watch your mouth. Jame doesn't. From that moment on, Jame continues, voice steady, you lost the right to teach your son what a challenge is. Silence slams down harder than the file did. Diep's throat tightens, but she doesn't look away. Mr. Hoan stares at Jame like he's seeing a stranger in his son's face. Because in Mr. Hoan's world, sons lower their eyes. They apologize. They soften when the father raises his voice. Jame does none of it. Mr. Hoan's lips part, like he's about to respond with something cutting, something cruel, something that will put Jame back in his place. But Diep's phone is still there, recording, and the wet pages of the file are still there, ruined, visible. Mr. Hoan's control is slipping through his fingers like water. He looks down at the mess, then up at Jame again. His voice lowers. Dangerous. You came here to humiliate me. James' reply is quiet. No, I came here so you understand I'm done hiding. Mr. Hoan steps from behind the desk. Slowly, deliberately, like he's reclaiming space, he stops just short of Jame, close enough that his presence feels heavy. You think you can win this? He says. You think you can stand in my office and talk to me like I'm some criminal? Jame doesn't back up. I think, Jame says, that you've been living too long in a world where people don't say no to you. Mr. Hoan's smile returns, thin and sharp. Then say no. James' eyes don't move. No. The word is simple. That's what makes it loud. Mr. Hoan's expression tightens again, and for a moment the room feels like it might tip into something uglier. But Diep speaks, steady and clear. The recording is running, she reminds him. Not a threat. A boundary. Mr. Hoan's gaze flicks to the phone again. He hates that small rectangle of truth on his desk. He hates how it changes the rules. Jame turns slightly, reaches for the door. Mr. Hoan's voice snaps after him. Walk out of here and you walk out of my life. Jame pauses with his hand on the handle. Diep's breath catches. For a second, it looks like the old wound might open. Filial piety tugging on James' spine, the boy inside him still craving a father's approval. Then James speaks, without turning back. You were already walking out of my life, he says quietly. You just wanted me to pretend it was my choice. He pushes the door open. Not gently, not carefully, firmly, like he's opening a new chapter and he doesn't want it to close behind him. The hallway light spills into the office, wide and bright. And before leaving, Jame does something Mr. Hoan did not expect. He steps out, and with a calm motion, he presses the lock. Click. A small sound, but it carries meaning. You don't control the door anymore. Diep remains for half a beat, eyes on Mr. Hoan. Her phone is still on the desk, recording. She reaches for it, picks it up slowly, and turns the screen just enough that Mr. Hoan can see the red dot one last time. Then she slips it into her pocket. Diep's voice is soft, almost respectful. You can stop here, she says, or you can keep speaking and let the world meet the real you. Mr. Hoan's eyes burn. Diep turns and walks out. The door remains wide open. The lock is engaged from the outside. Mr. Hoan stands in the middle of the room, alone, with wet files spread across the desk, torn paper in front of him, and the echo of a recording he can't erase. The office, for the first time, doesn't feel like a throne room. It feels like a stage after the curtain has been pulled back. Mr. Hoan looks at the mess. He looks at the open door. And slowly, the realization settles into his posture like a weight. His son is no longer an asset, and the girl is no longer a hostage. This time, his true nature showed, loud enough for the walls to remember it. He stands there, breathing hard through his nose, not because he's afraid, but because he's angry. Angry that control failed. Angry that love didn't break. Angry that his son looked him in the eye and said no, without shaking. In the hallway outside, Jame and Diep walk side by side, not holding hands, not needing to. Their steps are synchronized in a way that says, "We're done being moved." James' face is calm, but his eyes are stormy. Diep's expression is steady, but her chest feels tight, because she knows this isn't over. A man like Mr. Hoan doesn't lose once and become gentle. He loses once and decides what kind of man he wants to be next. And in the office behind them, Mr. Hoan remains frozen in the center of the room, staring at the ruined file like it's a mirror. For the first time, he isn't thinking like a father. He's thinking like an enemy. And the question that follows them out into the night is the most dangerous one yet. Now that Mr. Hoan has been exposed, now that his son won't bow and Diep won't tremble, will he stop before he ruins himself? Or will he keep making the same mistake, louder?
Diep và Diệp vào văn phòng Mr. Hoan, thấy tập hồ sơ bằng chứng đã bị ông giữ. Ông đập hồ sơ xuống bàn, mỉa mai và khẳng định ông nắm quyền. Diep rút bản đầu, xé đôi. Ông giữ bản cứng, chúng tôi giữ bản sau. Diệp đặt điện thoại đang ghi âm, hỏi tiếp tục hay dừng, khiến mọi lời nói có thể bị phơi bày. Mr. Hoan nổi giận, đập bàn, làm đổ cốc nước, hồ sơ ướt nhòe, mặt nạ rơi. Diep bước lên, dùng một đứa trẻ để đe dọa người lớn thì không còn quyền chạy. Thử thách, anh mở cửa bấm khóa từ ngoài. Diệp nhắc ông dừng lại hoặc để thế giới thấy một mặt thật. Mr. Hoan đứng một mình, hiểu Diep không còn là tài sản và